And joining us now from Berkeley, California, with more on this topic of ethical fashion and corporate responsibility in the wake of the tragedy in Bangladesh is David Bacon, writer, labor journalist, and associate editor of the Pacific News Service. David, thanks for joining us. Let's get straight into it. Even though several global retailers did forge an international fire and building safety agreement to reform the garment industry in Bangladesh, a majority of U.S. retailers rejected the accord, Walmart being one of them. Walmart unveiled its own plan for improving safety at garment factories like the one in Bangladesh. So what is the most important part of this international accord?
Well, the most important part is actually beyond the safety provisions and the enforceability of the agreement, which is also an important part of it, is the fact that this agreement also requires the contracting shops that are working for these major retailers to recognize and deal with the unions of workers. And at the same time, there's pressure being put on the government of Bangladesh to make it easier for workers to organize unions by not turning over, for instance, to the employer the names of workers who are trying to join the union. And I think that's also the dividing line now between those retailers who are willing to sign this agreement and those who are not. The ones who have signed are ones like PVH, which in the United States even has a history of dealing with unions, as well as the European brands, whereas the ones that have not signed it, like Walmart, like the Gap, are ones that historically have been extremely hostile to unions.
Well, one can make the argument that unions do not sit very well with corporations' bottom lines, but they are nonetheless trying to increase safety standards. So how difficult is it for international retailers to enforce safety standards and labor laws in countries like Bangladesh, where there's a lot of corruption and the protection of workers is rarely enforced at a governmental level?
I don't think that the retailers really have much interest in enforcing safety standards. The reason why they're in Bangladesh to begin with is not to provide workers with jobs or to provide workers with good working conditions. It's to make the maximum amount of profit possible by pushing down labor costs. Walmart Canada, for instance, had jeans made in the Ethertex factory, which was one of the ones in the building that collapsed there. And they were accepting those jeans into Canada at a cost between $3.50 and $4.50 a pair for jeans. Now you can imagine in Canada what they're turning around and selling those jeans for. The wages of the workers who are making those jeans are probably about 5 to 10% of that, $3.50 to $4.50 cost there. So really, this is what is driving those retailers to locate in Bangladesh. And of course, what we're seeing as well is that when the labor costs rise in Bangladesh or when they rise in China or some other country, then what the retailers do is they simply go to another country where the labor costs are even lower.
So then is it the government's fault that these conditions are still taking place? I mean, as you say, the corporations will look for the best deal. Is it up to the government of those particular countries to make sure that some sense of labor rights is enforced?
Well, yes, it is up to the government. They have a responsibility to do that. And of course, if workers have unions, they have a way of putting pressure on the government to have both adequate laws, but what's even more important is to enforce the laws that they have. So the government has some responsibility, but the trouble is the government also has a conflict of interest here because they also are under pressure to keep the labor costs in each country low, because the retailers essentially say to the governments that they're going to move somewhere else if the labor costs rise.
David, let's bring in the consumer over here. If you have an ethically concerned consumer who wants to make sure that they're buying clothes that are ethically produced, how is it possible to be sure that the jeans that you're picking up are not produced in a way that is contrary to your moral code?
Well, one of the organizations that is responsible for this new code in Bangladesh is called the Workers' Rights Consortium, and it's unique among the organizations that monitor the working conditions and the wages and the situation of workers in other countries because it is not financed and paid for by the garment industry. And so the Workers' Rights Consortium monitors those conditions, and people can find out what their reports are about the situation of workers country by country and even enterprise by enterprise. They have a website, and they're a pretty reliable source of information.
But the onus is then on the consumer to do a lot of research. You can't get that information by looking at the label, unfortunately. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're going to have to leave it there. David Bacon, thank you so much. David Bacon, writer, labor journalist, and associate editor of the Pacific News Service.